When using the UI collection view data source protocol, any object can act as the data source. This means that the view controller class that contains the collection view can also act as its data source. You can implement this with just a few lines of code. First, you need to adopt the relevant protocol. With this line of code, you're stating that the view controller class is going to be the data source for the collection view. Next, you need to let the collection view know that the view controller is going to be its data source. UI collection view has a settable property, data source, and you can assign the view controller to this property. Inside the viewDidLoad method, add You can also do this inside of a storyboard scene. Navigate to main.storyboard, and in the view controller scene, right-click on the collection view to bring up the outlet's modal. The first outlet listed here is the collection view's data source. Drag to the view controller object at the top of the screen to create the same connection you just did in code. Now, as a quick note, if you haven't used this square icon inside a circle before, it represents the view controller that loads this scene that you're defining. Back to the view controller. Now that you've established the relationship, you need to implement the required data source methods. Before you do that, though, I want to raise a very important point and actually undo the work you just did. It's very common for view controllers that contain collection views to act as the data source for the collection view as well. In fact, it is so common that Apple provides a subclass of UI view controller called UI collection view controller that specializes in managing a collection view. It not only already contains a collection view like the one you've defined here, but it is also wired up to act as both its data source and its delegate, something we'll talk about in a bit. In main.storyboard, you can search for collection view in the object library, and you'll notice that there is a collection view controller already predefined. If you drag it out onto the storyboard, you'll see that it has a collection view already, and if you right-click on the outlets for the collection view, you'll see that the data source and delegate are wired up as well. So you might think that because Apple provides this class, that these are good practices. In reality, though, it's not. We always want our classes to have a specific set of responsibilities. And by doing this, you have view controllers that are now responsible for setting up a view, for acting as a source of data for these views, and not to mention any other responsibilities that it might take on. In practice, you should always strive to separate these concerns. So what you're going to do here from day one is to create a dedicated object to act as your data source. So let's undo all the code you just wrote. We'll delete this. We'll disconnect the data source outlet in the storyboard scene if you hooked it up by tapping on this little X. We'll go back to view controller and we'll get rid of this line from viewDidLoad that assigns the view controller as the data source and remove the extension of view control that conforms to the data source protocol. Now add a new Swift file to your project. Name it data source and hit create. Since you're going to work with a UIKit based protocol, you need to replace the import foundation and import UIKit instead. Next, create a class named data source that will conform to the data source protocol. The data source class needs to inherit from NSObject because UI collection view expects its data source to be an Objective-C class and not a pure Swift one. This would have been handled automatically if view controller acted as its data source since it's already an Objective-C class. But here you need to be more explicit. In a typical data source object like this, you would define a stored property for the underlying data and initialize the class with data. I've provided all the data in the starter project in the emoji.swift file. The emoji type is set up as a singleton so that you can easily reference it in code. So inside of the data source, add a property to keep a reference to the data at the top. In the next video, let's add the data source methods.